Hi everyone, and welcome to Breaking the Spell. And today we have an interesting guest on our show today, and that is Taylor Hickem. All right, so Taylor is someone that we've known for quite a while, and we're interested to have him on because he has actually contributed quite a bit to discourse in terms of environmental politics, climate justice, and Taylor is actually in the midst of creating his own podcast project, so he's going to be a fellow community member of the podcast community. So anyway, Taylor, thanks for coming on. Let me just introduce you a little bit first. So basically, like I mentioned, he's the host of the upcoming podcast called Making an Impact, which is part of the Singapore Green New Deal. That is your project. It's an initiative to bring the just transition to a net zero carbon economy using a bottom-up grassroots social movement approach. Taylor has been active in the green community. He's volunteered for local organizations like 350.org, Singapore Climate Rally, Climate Conversations, and Zero Waste SG. Interestingly, Taylor, he actually started his career as a chemical bioengineer at Jurong Island with big names like ExxonMobil before transitioning to your current role as a data detective for a local educational tech startup. And in your free time, from what I understand, you enjoy life hacking, coding, Python, and perfecting your sourdough bread, which you haven't brought with us today. But it's okay, we let you off the hook for that. But anyway, Taylor, so like I said, thanks for coming on.
Next time.
Yeah, so look, we always start the show with a good way for you to talk about yourself a little bit. So our first question to you is, when it was the first time that you realized that the world is not the way it should be?
Thank you, by the way, for the invitation to be on the YouTube community. It's really an honor. All right, so there were a couple of events in my life, four in particular that kind of come to mind. The first one was I grew up as a kid in the United States, and at a time of relative affluence as a millennial, thinking, you can pull the world by your bootstraps, right? Okay. So for me as a teenager in September 11th, 2001, that was probably the first shock, where there's what I had thought about the world was just not true. So there was that shot, watching the tower come down, right? Very heartbreaking, experience. Reminder that there's something else out there outside your control. Now, being a kid from Florida, there were numerous circumstances, this ties back to climate change, where I experienced being in a hurricane. So there's Hurricane Andrew that completely changed people's lives in Homestead, Florida. Little kid at that time, right? But there were three other events getting a little closer to my more recent experiences in the climate change, right? The second one was a financial crisis in September of 2008. And that was when it really hit home that, because I used to be very much a card-carrying libertarian, and still to this day, there are still some parts that I feel are an important part of society, right? Uplifting people out of poverty and, providing a path for people with their own social mobility. So still, I feel like there's a lot of merit in a lot of that. But I really was like an Ayn Rand kind of.
Oh man.
No, it's true. I did really feel like markets are the way to go. And so suddenly, when this happened, it was again that big reality check that what I was previously thinking was working well clearly was not working well, right? A lot of suffering from that. I was shielded from that, but it's very clear that had rippling effects in that part of the world that are still lasting today, right? Political and economic. The third kind of event was I would say my climate epiphany moment, where I really suddenly just hit me the shock of what situation we're in as society with climate change. And that was in March of 2019. There were, maybe I might go into that a little bit more detail, and I've written a little bit about that. And then the fourth event was of June 1st of 2020, when a lot of this is the context of US politics, but it was when there was this Lafayette Square moment, and they were gassing protesters. Because just right before that, I had actually been in a similar circumstance in Hong Kong, and I was just thinking, I was just livid that I'm in Hong Kong, I'm putting myself at risk because I believe that there's a cause, that there's values of democracy, there's values of whatever, that I'm sort of putting myself in the line for. And it's the place where I feel like, it's safe that those values are respected is the place where I came from. And to just that shock to see that, no, in fact, that isn't true. So these were kind of some disruptive events where I had this reality check that the world that I thought, the institutions I thought I could rely on, and the sort of relative safety or things I thought I could just take for granted were certainly not true.
Yeah. What was happening in March 2019? I'm curious.
Yeah, so there's a little bit more to that, yeah. In March 2019, maybe taking a little bit of a step back, like before that, I was in a position of I was kind of at a high point in my life in 2017, because financially I had kind of reached a sort of an achievement.
You reached the moon.
I was doing very well financially. Yeah. My spouse at the time and I were just living a life of relative affluence, and I was starting to feel comfort, and there was starting to be this wrestling sense of, you can say, a little bit of boredom or a little bit of, I was like, can I be doing more? What's the next challenge, right? So, that kind of really can only happen when you're in a place of privilege, right? So that started a thinking process where I wanted to do more. I wanted to look for a new challenge, and I wanted to give back to society in some way. I didn't want to just keep putting all my efforts for the rest of my life into making this oil company more money. So I went off into a kind of entrepreneurial venture in vertical farming. That was my first project in 2018. And then comes March 2019. And there was essentially like kind of 4 factors that was a big disruptor for me in that moment in my life. One of them was, my spouse at the time was instrumental, influential role in really kind of presenting the problem of climate change to me in terms that I could relate with. First of all, just because she was someone so important to me in my life and she's someone close to me at the time, then I'm feeling the strong emotional reaction she has. So some of that just transfers over. You can't help it, right? She's clearly alarmed. So I felt some of that alarm. I can't help but pay attention, right? Just on an emotional level. Secondly, she's also speaking to me in the language that's my language, which is charts and graphs. Yeah, I'm not, if I really think about it. And so when I saw those graphs, I was, again, going back to something's not right. Basically, and I don't know why I had this perception, honestly. I don't have any excuses, okay? But I had this perception, rightly or wrongly, that we still had a lot of time. Right. And when I saw those graphs, which ultimately, those graphs she's showing me came from the IPCC report. So really, she and I were really instruments in the epic, very disruptive event, which was October of 2018. So that was the origin where things started changing, right? And she's showing me those graphs. So those graphs really mattered. So it's to show that really the science does kind of move things. So the graphs spoke to me in my language, a way I could relate with. Another factor was my role, and who I was, my identity. So for me, I'm very proud of the fact that I'm a Georgia Tech engineer. I know it sounds silly, but that's a big part. If people who know me, they know, yeah, that was a big part of my life transition and my identity. So engineers are problem solvers. And we have a kind of, a duty of care, to use our talents in ways that makes the world a better place. Making things safer, more efficient. That's what an engineer is called to do. And not just being a Georgia Tech engineer, but also working for these large petrochemical organizations, which have very strong ethical values. I know it. So you're going to see why this was really getting to your point about this is really where it hits home on your real question, right? Because it was this dissonance of, you know, this shock that that's not how things actually are working. Because I really put a lot of trust in these institutions, that they do the science right, they listen to the science, and then they use that science, because I'm part of that process. I am an engineer in that process. I'm part of the technology organization. And so I spent a lot of energy as a engineer in that environment, and as an employee in that culture that really believes this belief that safety first. I mean, if you're in the industry, then you know that is a cultural norm. They may very well have financial reasons why, but for a lot of the people, I do honestly believe it. Safety first. And what that means is there are some decisions that are just non-negotiable. Even if they're going to make more money, we're not going to pursue them. And it's like this ethics, infused with ethics. And so in 2019, when I started reading about, you know, the denialism, I was livid. I was absolutely livid, because that was that breach of trust, and it was hurtful to me. And the fact that I was kind of a part of that. And kind of along the same thread, again, my identity as an engineer, I take my job very seriously, is a very emotional thing for me is to go through these disasters, these large-scale disasters, where these, you know, Deepwater Horizon and Piper Alpha. I remember the first time I saw these Piper Alpha. I don't know if you guys are familiar, but Piper Alpha was a platform in the 1980s and it basically, like, it was just due to a series of bad decisions, one after another, that led finally to an explosion, and lots of people were killed in this offshore platform. And it's, as chemical engineer, I'm entrusted with, I mean, we're not the only people, but we are entrusted with designing the systems so they don't lead to those large-scale disasters. And so we learn about the human and behavioral factors. And there are some things that I learned along the way that are very real to me as very dangerous threats. And that's colorless, odorless as gases. And so you can see how now, what's a colorless, odorless gas that's probably about to kill us all? Carbon dioxide.
CO2.
Yeah. So, I mean, I really felt like everything that I had been taught about, you know, a recipe for disaster is climate change. So, I mean, it was kind of this, I felt this personal sense of responsibility of the role that I had to act on this. And then the kind of the final factor in, you know, what really made a difference for me, and I call it my epiphany moment, right? Was there was a relatable voice that spoke to me that I could relate with, and that was Greta Thunberg. Because the way she spoke, the language she used was something I could relate with personally. And so these were kind of a couple, they were just these converging factors. And then maybe the last one is that, I know I said last, but I'm tacking on. The last one is, it really never really hit home, and I literally, like, tears just really started streaming down my eyes. I cried for 3 days straight. Was when I actually started typing it out in my own words. And that was a big difference. It was a big difference between what a lot of, the big gap that a lot of people don't cross, between sympathizing with a problem and acting on it and owning it. And it was when I started describing the problems in my own words. I took out a Google document, you know, and it was when I really started describing it. We have this many years left. I was just like, oh my God. And so, yeah, that was March of 2019.
Okay, yeah, no, because 2019 stood out for me as well, because I think, yeah, that was the year that Greta Thunberg started her school strikes, and that was my moment of epiphany. You know, I was like, if, you know, a schoolgirl is standing up and taking action against this, what right do I have to just stay at home? You know?
Yeah, I actually love everything you said, because I think it hits on main points that I'd like us to expand on. So one is how important it was for a close loved one to actually be able to explain the problem in your own language, right? And actually on our show, we talk a lot about like how maybe when it comes to issues about climate change and you know, trying to push people to change or to act on it, we prefer narratives. You know, human beings generally prefer narratives, not data or science-based narratives, right? But for you, unfortunately, unfortunately, but you know, by a very funny kind of way, it was actually the graphs and the data that convinced you.
Yeah.
And then of course, I like also your other point about how, and I liked it because I like the point about how you see your role as an engineer, not just in a technocratic fashion, but there is also this humane aspect that you, as an engineer, you're supposed to solve problems, and not solve problems because of profit, but really to contribute to, you know, human goodness and societal good, right? And also like Unsu, as you mentioned, how Greta Thunberg was also that beacon, right? You can imagine if there was a world without her. I don't know whether you'd be just as motivated, or would you find someone inspirational to kind of follow along, right? So actually, I was going to ask you, what kind of kick-started your change from being this chemical engineer to now being, I don't know whether you want to define yourself as an activist. So I was going to ask you about that because, in your report, right, your website, you've written stuff about Green New Deal and about social movements. We're going to go into that later. But I'm going to just hit you with your definition, okay, of what an activist is. So you said that it's someone who's resourceful, goal-oriented, with limited personal resource, who wants to change the rules of how society operates by leveraging on social movements to create a new political force on a scale much larger than themselves. So do you see yourself that way? Do you think, that was it difficult also for you to transit out being someone who works for a big company, a big petroleum company, to being who you are right now?
And this was a bit of this took place over several years too.
Right.
So, the first step was to be an entrepreneur for this vertical farming effort. And I guess I'd like to connect with this definition of an activist first, maybe, because I feel like in Singapore this is a delicate topic, and it's even more delicate when it's coming from me.
Yep.
So an activist, I guess, in context in the United States, we think of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and we basically, not everyone, but a lot of us, it's a noble thing. And there may be some context where that word is used here in a noble way, but my impression is that not everybody shares that view. It can mean different things to different people, anywhere from a troublemaker or a rebel rouser to a social change maker and somebody who's trying to advocate for positive change in society, right? Whole wide map. And so you can say there's different types of activists. Maybe that's one way of looking at it. I got plugged into communities here locally, and to me, I maybe went out with my first guns and my first instincts on what I thought activism looks like, and it wasn't. I didn't always make choices that I was proud of.
Well, just to sharpen the question a little bit, when you were in the US, right, so prior to coming to Singapore, were you
Yeah.
also partaking in...
No.
Oh, okay.
No. Well,
Okay.
most of my adult life has been here in Singapore. So.
Right.
And so, I mean, I wanted to really understand. So I wrote this report, the social movement report, and I'm fascinated. I really wanted to understand and unpack this because I understood it was something that was an uncomfortable conversation often to have in Singapore. So I said, okay, well, I want to lean into both sides. Because I really admire the stories of the bravery and courage of people like Rosa Parks and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., John Lewis.
Yep.
So I have that side, but then also I'm like, okay, well, I definitely can appreciate these stories where it's just this one person all by themselves. They get hauled away to the authorities and nothing happens out of that, which I think is what's very on the minds of a lot of Singaporeans when they think of this. So I'm talking about a very special, narrow slice of activism that's involving civil disobedience and non-cooperation, right? Well, there's a whole wide range of activism. It's a very broad spectrum, right? So that's why I wanted to be careful about defining what an activist is, and it's when you really, maybe that long sentence, maybe another way of thinking it is where you're motivated by something other than personal gain. It's about others, about systemic change, and you are employing tactics that involve maybe a little bit more risk, but they're more high reward. So you're not going for those safe, low-hanging fruit options. You're really going for the big bang for your buck, right? So if I keep it general in that sense, in that word, then that widens the net for what it means to be an activist, right? So I definitely was involved in some type of activities you can consider activism. I don't call myself an activist, but I think if we broaden that definition, then I feel like all of us in some ways that are concerned about a cause, whether be it climate change, be it inequality, and we're willing to do something about it, and we're gonna not just do tiny little baby steps that actually aren't really moving the needle, but we really want to use high leverage tactics, then I think a lot of us can fit that, can relate with that.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things Douglas and I agreed on very early on is we also don't like to think of ourselves as activists as a noun. I mean, we like to think of it as a verb. We are active, we're activating. And I like your notion of high risk and high return activities, because I think, I like that framing. Like, an activist is someone who thinks beyond their personal values, and you want to push for structural change, more long-lasting structural change. And that is invariably going to be a bit high risk because the status quo will always protect itself. So if you're trying to push for structural change, you're always going to get pushback. But if you can persevere, the rewards are high because you can move the needle in a permanent way. So I like that way of thinking about it.
Yeah, so maybe let's go into talking a little bit about, you started out, at least to me from what I understand about you, was your initiative, the Singapore Green New Deal. And just for our viewers, right, because maybe they may not even understand what a Green New Deal is, can you just go through some basics, what people need to understand about Green New Deal, about what your project was all about, Singapore Green New Deal, and just talk to us about some of your key ideas and arguments about that project.
All right, I'll try to be concise. The first thing is maybe I'll cover the whole Green New Deal framework, which is really a movement. It's a movement that leads us directly to action. And so it's based on five key points. First one is a problem analysis of what the actual root cause of climate change is. And there will be different views, but for me, something that kind of what I found is common to lots of those views is that the root cause of the climate crisis. And the climate crisis is not just the problem of global warming, where we've got, it's basically a physics problem. When I say climate crisis, it's a failure to act and respond to that information adequately at a societal scale. That's the crisis. So the root cause of that crisis, so in other words, the problem itself is a political and social problem, so the root causes are ultimately psychological and social. It's a pattern of decision making that prioritizes the here and now over others and long-term investments. And so that to me is what ties together the rest of the Green New Deal sort of movement actions and strategies. Because the next point is that these are claims. The next claim is that governments at a systemic level are much more efficient in a better position to tackle this than through the alternative, which honestly, the only other alternative is private markets and financial markets, right? We're talking about a systemic level. So the third claim is that, and I will get in more detail into this, but the third claim is that the best policy solution for governments to enact to really deal with this problem fully, not just because what we want is ultimately to say we want to improve lives. I mean, there are different people out there. I always tell people I'm not an environmentalist. I always tell people this. I'm a humanist. I want to save human lives. I want to make human lives better. And so what that means is there are certain options I'm just going to say, well, that don't make sense because it pits human well-being against the environment, and I'm not for that. So I'm looking for solutions that overall we win as a human. Overall, there's aggregate, there's more better well-being for society, right? So that's the ultimate goal. That's the driving, motivating force. So a policy solution that achieves that goal is, my humble opinion, is a Green New Deal. So I'll get to that in a bit as to what that actually is. But the fourth claim is, I feel like I had done enough talking, I guess, about policy, but I felt like I need to go further in my message to say in my overall Green New Deal as a movement message, which is that the way to actually get that legislation passed, whether it's here in Parliament, whether it's over in the US, in their two quirky chambers, filibusters and all that fun, the way to do that is through social movement. So then that was one of my reports, right? It's like unpacking the social movements and what does that mean, which leads me to the last claim, which is now looking here in Singapore in a more local term, how do we actually make a first step in the social movement, given that none of us in this room consider ourselves activists. So then how do we have a social movement in a place where nobody's an activist? And so that's when I'm like, well, does that mean we're stuck? And I would say absolutely not, because social movements have multiple actors, in multiple different ways. It's not only, the activists, but you've got a lot of people acting. So for me, it's number one, it's a strategy. So I'm talking about a strategy for social movement in Singapore. One is being in cooperation with the government. And the reason I say that is because by and large, really, for better or for worse, there's a lot of legitimacy here. People really do place a lot of trust in the government. It's a very strong institution compared to other places like, let's say, Myanmar,
right.
Where it's kind of iffy. So working, having strategies that are ultimately working in parallel in cooperation with the government, to me it's probably realistically, that's going to be what I would promote as of strategy. And then the second piece is what I feel is the lacking, really the deficient one, maybe the where most of the resources may need to really go, is building flourishing communities. And I'm not just talking about like just having drinks and having fun, but I'm talking about having meaningful, functional communities that are that the members are actually the ones that are participating in the choices. There's new modes of governance that people are trying now, like sociocracy and stuff. But I'm talking about really functional communities that are really making a difference for the members themselves, right? So it's working in cooperation with the government and building flourishing communities. So that's the 5 points of the Green New Deal overall message, because then that leads right into what to do and how to get involved. Okay, but what's in the policy? And if you like, I can get into that.
So we'll get into that, but I just want to contextualize this a little bit too, because I think I also want viewers to know that there's certain history behind the use of the word New Deal, because it's based on, I'm not strong in my American history, FDR, right?
Absolutely,
he was the one who came up with the New Deal. It was meant to, Taylor, you should explain this better than I do, which is, to empower the labor class to make it more equitable, push out more workers' rights. And in this case, right, we have a certain branch in America, like the more leftist-leaning Democrats that have come up with this idea of a Green New Deal. So, AOC is one of those proponents, right? One of those policymakers, designers of it, to suggest that we can take this idea from FDR and create a green version of this, right? So just to get viewers up to speed, okay, so the major political candidate that was supporting this and pushing for this was Bernie Sanders. Unfortunately, he's not the president of the United States right now, it's Joe Biden. And so we're not actually seeing a Green New Deal being enacted in the US. And now I understand that even the discourse around it is kind of, is fading, right? Because Joe Biden has a different idea about what he would want to do. So again, just to contextualize this. So if I say anything that's wrong, please help me clarify. So that's one.
I do. Yeah. I'll wait for you to finish.
Then from there on, right, I'd like you to talk about how, from looking at this model, right, what I want you to do is to take us through what a Singapore version of this would look like.
All right. Yeah. Sounds good. Okay. The first thing I'll do is maybe talk a little about the Biden and the Bernie one, and then we'll get over to the U.S. And also maybe connect it back to FDR, right? So the New Deal also was kind of green, because they set up a whole lot of these, like I can't quite remember the agencies, but essentially they did their own version of tree planting. There's the Tennessee Valley Authority and all these. Basically, they created national parks and stuff. So it was a Green New Deal at that time. But the basic concept, the basic idea of how it works is you get people working. It's a massive government stimulus program that creates jobs. Green jobs, they say, right? But a green job doesn't necessarily have to be you're planting trees. A green job could also be that you're a healthcare worker. It could be that you're a caregiver. And the reason why those are green jobs is because they're low emissions, right? So anything that's low emissions would be a green job, valid, right? and you're investing in people's lives. So, you're pouring money into the social needs that people have to, if it's a 40-year-old worker who got laid off in the petchem industry or manufacturing, it's just there's layoffs, and then he gets upgraded to tech. So you're meeting the needs in people's lives where they need it. If you're a single mom and you are having trouble sort of upgrading your own skills, taking night courses because you have to take care of your kids, then you get some childcare credits, then that's that relief for you. And then of course, there's all these jobs being created because you're pouring money into transforming Jurong Island, you're pouring money into expanding the solar capacity, you're pouring money into technology development in electrical vehicles. So all this investments is ultimately creating jobs, and it's ultimately allowing people to feel hopeful about their future and their kids and everything, right? And you're meeting their needs, right? And that's what a Green New Deal is. And I feel like, so I'm being a little, that's what a Green New Deal is supposed to be. If we talk about the Rooseveltian, ethos, it's, and I mean, what is it in contrast to? So that sounds like a great deal. Sure, I'll sign up. So what's the alternative? Well, the alternative is where you just let the markets do the thing. And you basically, well, I'll call it slap a carbon tax on it and call it done, right? So a Green New Deal is a much more ambitious, the scope is bigger, the price tag is bigger. And I guess maybe another aspect of the Green New Deal is it's based on the principle that people who have the means and are most responsible for it are the ones that are going to pay for it. So that means higher corporate income tax, maybe a wealth tax, maybe the upper income, the people that are in the upper income thresholds, maybe they need to pay a little bit more marginal tax rates. So that's another part of a Green New Deal, because a Green New Deal is not financially irresponsible. I've heard some people say, well, why don't we just ignore inflation? No. It has to pay for itself. So yeah, I mean, it's financially responsible. It means we have to figure out who's going to pay for it. And carbon tax, of course, the emitters would pay for it too, right? But it's not just emitters. It's those who have benefited from the system would pay for it. So in terms of Bernie Sanders and Biden, I watched the debates, and there was a time when Biden, frankly, didn't have a very impressive climate agenda. But he didn't just stick to his guns on that one. He listened. He brought people. He listened to what the winds were changing, and he incorporated a lot of those ideas in. And I would say that Build Back Better, should it pass in some form, mention that I honestly I feel like that would meet, because I went and I said, can I define what a Green New Deal is, right? What it is and what it isn't. And I'm like, I looked at Build Back Better. I'm like, that's it. I mean, it's a Green New Deal. So
right. So at this point of our recording, we have not seen that passed. And I don't want to take this show into American politics, but so there's a lot of skepticism whether it's going to be passed. Let's just put it that way. Fair. Okay, Unsu, why not?
But yeah, Singapore, right? We can get into the Singapore context, right?
Well, I just had a quick question about. I know in the US there's also something called the Sunrise Movement. How is that different from the Green New Deal? Are they the same or are they different?
Well, so in this case, I just presented Singapore Green New Deal as a concept, a framework for potential movement, which honestly I feel like I'm not saying anything much different from what SG Climate Rally's already put out, to be fair, right? In many ways, I would say we more or less have the same general vision and theory of change, right? And that would be maybe the analogy in the United States. So I suppose in the United States, Green New Deal is just this idea by EOC that's just going to sit on the docket and never see the light of day. But the real true Green New Deal, I honestly feel, is actually embedded in the real legislation that may actually end up passing with Bill. Okay, we don't know, right? But Sunrise Movement is it's the equivalent of SG Climate Rally for the United States. It's grassroots organizers that are actually just going out and they're pushing for change, in whatever little arenas they can get, they'll get it. And it doesn't they're not limiting themselves only to the political arena and Build Back Better. They're also alongside union workers, and so they're on a grassroots level, sort of coalition building and aiming for a political change where they can get the gains today rather than wait for who knows how long it'll take Manchin come to Jesus.
Okay, let me put this question now because I mean you gave a really good in-depth kind of explanation about what a Green New Deal is. So let's put it this way for the viewers, just to make it simple for them to understand. That would be considered very aspirational, transformative, very fundamental, transformative changes in society. It definitely would change the social compact. It would change, like as you mentioned, tax structure. It would change industries, right? So as compared to, as you say, the status quo solution right now is just slap on carbon tax, right?
Slap on carbon tax.
Right.
Yeah.
So anyway, and let's put it in context, right? In Singapore, the government, as compared to some other world leaders or previous world leaders, are very realistic about climate change. They do acknowledge it. They do produce a lot of content and information campaigns about, we need to recognize that, right? But they have a certain narrative, right? And that narrative is that they say that they want to target, they would frame themselves as climate realists, not aspirational, not looking for fundamental change. I even have this quote here from Melissa Goh from the Energy Studies Institute. She actually praised Singapore, saying that we are one of the countries in the world that sets the most realistic targets. And those targets, just to make it more explicit, it involves halving peak emissions by 2050 and aiming for net zero carbon emissions as soon as viably possible. So it's kind of like a unforeseen goal. It's not stated when exactly we will reach it, like the non-zero carbon emission, but just as soon as possible. So I mean, what I want to ask you, and also just feel free to jump in, is, do you like this kind of narrative, this idea that, we're being realistic here, we are going with what we can do, or do you think this is really just, give it, what's the word, like you let yourself off the hook because you don't want to aim for something much more deeper and something that actually would entail us really living up to some real moral responsibility to the planet, to our future generations, to providing a viable, greener future, right?
Okay, so in my opinion, this word realistic, the way that it's being used in this context is not clear enough to be able to really unpack and respond to it. So what I can relate, what I would 100% agree with as an engineer, and sometimes within green communities, honestly, I sometimes push back a bit on, like you say, let's be realistic, right? So for me, I don't want to just spend all my time on something that'll never see the light of day. So in that sense, we agree. The thing is, as an engineer, the word that we use, because for me, to get my work done, to actually see real change and actually solve a problem, it talks about problem solving, right? The word is constraints, because we have, and to be successful as an engineer, I need to understand in very clear terms what my constraints are, because that's how I can actually go about actually addressing the issue, either by moving the constraints or by understanding that my solution space is here. And so if we talk about constraints in the context of a Green New Deal or global warming policy, there's a couple constraints to consider. One of them is the physical constraints. And when some of the rhetoric and narrative comes out about Singapore that they have limited national circumstances, it's based on a kernel of truth. The truth is, I looked at it, and this is something I sometimes have a hard time getting across to the green community. Some of the things that they mentioned, they're not considering the actual technical constraints. It's true, Singapore doesn't have all the options that other countries may have, especially if we're talking about renewables, because a country that has like a lot of hydro can maybe go up to 80, 90% renewables in the grid, but not Singapore. That shouldn't really be floated as something that is realistic because there's constraints. There are actual physical constraints that limit the options. So other constraints to consider, other than the physical constraints, are political constraints and legal constraints. So in the case, like we talked about the US, Joe Manchin, that's a constraint. Biden can't move around that, right? So everybody knows what that is, and so, but he can do other things, right? In a Singapore context, they have a majority. They have a very big majority, right? So a lot of whatever may be blocking them from taking on this legislation, that's not visible. Whereas in the US, like Manchin will go on Fox News and he'll say, I'm against this. And say, oh, you don't have his vote. We don't have that. I don't have that same kind of visibility of where the constraints are. So when I look at the situation, constraint doesn't mean like these ill-defined concerns that cannot be turned into defined in material terms. So to me, I'm like, show me the public opinion polls, which those are real constraints. Show me how the rules work in Parliament. Show me, maybe public positions that public individual members of Parliament have taken where that guy, you won't be able to get his vote. From my point of view, when I look at Singapore, I don't see the constraints. And because I'm also looking at, I crunch the numbers because I go big on the numbers, right?
Yep.
And like I crunch numbers and I'm like, hey guys, I mean, if we talk about like, what are the limits of how much public spending you can have before you burst your debt limits? So I crunch those numbers and I'm like, so 2% of GDP or 1% of GDP per year, this is something that's not out of the ballpark of the experience range of what countries have done before. We look at our COVID spending. So this is not a outlandishly large thing. When we look at the carbon tax rates, $75 a ton US dollars, that's what IMF is recommending. That's almost what almost all the economists are recommending. And these economists have crunched the numbers and they're like, no, I mean, you can do this. This is not gonna bust your bank, right? And if you done responsibly and you couple it where you cushion the people who might get, the low income people, the vulnerable people, if you cushion them from it, then this is, so when I go and I actually go into the details, and I do this in my reports, and I'm like, because I'm very much a problem solver, and I'm like, okay, what are the constraints? What are the constraints? And you look at my reports, you'll see I go through them. And every time I've done that, I'm like, no, I mean, this is doable. So I guess to Melissa, I'd love to have a conversation with her, but I'd love to talk more to her about, or anyway, it's not just Melissa, but I mean, really, when we're talking about Singapore, I'm like, this is a very wealthy country. We're not talking about, Burkina Faso or whatever, where they don't have a lot of wealth. There's a tremendous amount of money here in Singapore, a lot of surplus wealth. And what we're talking about in terms of that amount of wealth that would be needed for this Green New Deal, I would say certainly there can be a budget for it. So, and with the majority in Parliament, it's not like this razor thin margin like they have in the U.S. Right. I feel like they even have political capital to spend. So that's what I'm trying to get at. Right. So I don't see the constraints. So I would put it back to this other voice to say, show me the constraints.
I think it's great that you actually have the technical skill to analyze all these things, and I'd love to get into it later, like how you actually go about that. But but even from a non-technical perspective, I can already see that a lot of seeming constraints that we think are there are really just self-imposed. I mean, I think COVID has shown us that in the midst of a crisis, your view of what are constraints radically changes. I mean, if before COVID you had said, oh, we need to cancel all transatlantic flights, or we cannot allow gatherings of more than 5 people. I mean, people would say, that's ridiculous. We need to have trade, we need to have, economic activity. But, when you have a crisis or when you have, a bigger imperative, I mean, all of a sudden the set of constraints can radically change. I'm actually thinking of Donella Meadows' essay, Leverage Points in the System. I don't know if you're familiar with it.
No,
but
you'll have to.
Previous guest on the show, Sarah Ichioka, she mentioned it in a book that she wrote, and it's really cool. So Donella Meadows, she was a very influential systems thinker. I think she also contributed to the Club of Rome report back in the 70s that predicted our current predicament. And so she knows what she's talking about. But in this essay, she talked about all the different leverage points you can have in a system, and she ranked them in the order of most effectiveness. And the number one most effective leverage point was just the paradigm out of which you're operating. And so like in Sarah's book, I mean, she just makes this point that as long as we are stuck in our current paradigm, we're going to be stuck in our thinking. We're going to think, oh, we can't do this, we can't do that. And what we really need to do is change the paradigm. And so, for instance, if I think about the reality of Singapore, I think one of the paradigms that we need to get out of is that at the end of the day, everything we do has to maximize profits or has to have some kind of financial maximization objective. And that's the problem I have with a lot of like policies that involve, let's say, carbon taxes, or even having ESG constraints on companies, because a lot of these approaches are like, oh, okay, as long as we tick that box, we can now be free to pursue whatever financial maximization project we have, right? So as long as we offset our carbon taxes, our carbon, we can fly as much as possible. But what we actually really need to do is change the goal of the system. The goal of the system shouldn't be financial maximization. We need, as a society, we really need to be thinking about a different set of goals. So protecting biodiversity, right? And putting that as the goal. And once you have that, then yeah, a whole new landscape of constraints appears.
Just want to say one quick thing, which is what you just added on, just dovetail very well with our previous episode on objective measures, because the whole idea about like a company can feel comfortable and complacent, just feeling like, oh, if I tick these boxes, this objective set of measures, then that's it, I'm good to go with financial maximization, even, regardless of what the, ecological consequences are. So yeah. I think I just have a quick rejoinder to your, your commentary. I guess what I would say also, just to add on to this whole complex mix of factors is, I guess in Singapore it's just the lack of political will among the populace, right? But that being said, in the last election, I remember there was an independent candidate, I'm so sorry I don't remember your name right now, but this one lone guy just going out there running a campaign just purely on climate change, and he felt like, the government was not taking enough proactive action in, having a platform and legislature change on climate change. And I mean, there was a speck of hope that there are very consistent Singaporeans out there who are trying to broadcast their concerns, and hopefully they also would then push for this paradigmic change, as you mentioned. Yeah. So yeah, do you want to respond first, or should I ask the next question for you?
Well, in terms of public messaging and like maybe actors in the system, political actors, right? So I'm constantly being surprised when I follow the Singapore government when it comes to climate change. Surprised in a sense of being disappointed. The Green Plan 2030 was one of those moments where I felt like there was just so much hype. Right. I felt like all the lead up and all that they were signaling, because it was around the time there was climate action or the summit or whatever. I felt like they were actually coming up with something. Right. And then I was so disappointed. I was like, what? All you did was you just repackaged all your existing policies. What? It's such a letdown, right? Yeah. So that was an example I was just disappointed. And there were several disappointments along the way, right? But then very recently on January 12th this year, I just felt like there's a whole new parliament discussion going on about the motion. Right? And I saw all the speeches and stuff, and I was like, wow. I said, this conversation I would have never imagined would have been happening back in 2019, and it just came out of nowhere. I didn't get any, maybe I wasn't following, but it just came as a surprise. And Louis Ng's speech there, because you talk about political actors, he basically nailed what I would be advocating for, which is to raise the carbon tax, $75 a ton, is to set scientific targets to net zero by 2050, which our friend earlier that you quoted, thinks is unrealistic. Yeah. So, but apparently Louis disagrees, so right. You don't have to ask me. Right. Just Louis, disagrees, right? So Louis thinks it's possible. And when I I watched the video, right, late at night, I mean, I felt like there was sort of a very much a Green New Deal kind of policy construction conversation going on in that conversation in Parliament, because they were talking about all these talking points which really are necessary for designing a Green New Deal, which you need to look out for the people that will be marginalized, you need to think about jobs. They're having all the right conversations. So it looks, to me, it's like, wow, okay, maybe I don't have to do anything more. But I've been fooled one time before, so I wanted to say something about three public messaging kind of challenges, I'll say, for Singapore. One of them, I think, is definitely, I don't feel that people really understand what Singapore could actually be doing. I feel like there's two extremes. One of them is there's this perception like we can go to 100% renewables, but okay, there's some real technical red flags there. And then on the other hand, it's like, well, we're already doing more than we can even do, and we can't expand an inch more on our solar, which is some very, very unambitious targets, right? So somewhere in these two, neither one of these two extremes is correct. And I feel like that's missing in the public narrative. That's why I wrote my books, my articles, because I wanted to put down in writing with all the research and references there, this is what we can be doing, this is what we're missing, right? In the 5 switches, right? My 5 switches, not the government's 5 switches, my 5 switches. The other public messaging concern that I have is about plastics and waste. And this is where I might not be very popular in the green community, but I just have to say that tackling global warming has very different solutions than tackling pollution and plastic pollution and waste. And in some cases, they may even contradict and come in conflict with one another. Why? Because a lot of conversations, public messaging on global warming gets channeled and redirected, if you've watched it, towards waste and plastics, if you notice, right? And to me, I'm not saying don't try to solve the plastics problem, but what I am saying is that's not really what the problem of global warming is about. Global warming is about our energy systems and, like you said, how economy works and stuff. This is more directly related to what's causing emissions. And I think that diverts a lot of the potential resources that we could be using to tackle this, because they really ultimately get diverted towards something which is very far from the timeless solutions. Because, for example, we talk about circular, from a thermodynamic point of view, and I've had this conversation with a lot of people recently, you can actually be worse off on emissions if you try to go with circular, because when you try to recycle things, that may end up being more energy intensive. So I feel like the plastic, I'm not saying let's not do plastics, but what I am saying is in the messaging, I think in the messaging on global warming, I feel like getting it on track to our energy systems, there's work to be done there. And then the other part of public messaging is sometimes within solutioning, 4 different kind of ways of tackling it sometimes get brought up. And the way I like to communicate that is they're each different components of the Kaya identity. Have you heard of the Kaya identity?
No.
Okay, so it's a very simple mathematical formula to tell you how you get global emissions. It's population times the income per capita times the energy intensity per dollar of GDP times the carbon emissions per kilowatt hour. And that's your Kaya identity. So you have these 4 factors. And the way I like to communicate, so what that means is our solution's got to be some combination of these, right? And
I thought you were referring to our local coconut jam.
I know the Kaya butter. Well, if that helps,
very localized example.
I know if that helps, we could have a campaign where people remember.
I think that would be great.
Kaya butter,
Serious, perfect.
Kaya butter emission.
It's my favorite jam in the morning.
But yeah, that's where I think people will say, well, we got too many people, or okay, the problem, that was like Michael Moore's film, right? We got too many people. Right?
Yeah, just to be clear, that was not Michael Moore's. It wasn't something he directed, but he was just one production finances of it or something like that. Yeah, just to be clear about that. Yeah, but I know what you're talking about, because I did hear this narrative quite a bit among, and I wouldn't consider them environmentalists, just among some people I know that who do think that the way to resolve the not just climate but the environmental crisis is really just to have less people. That's the way to see it.
And that's the thing is, there's these 4. From a mathematical point of view, it has to be one or some combination of these 4, right? And if we really go through them one by one and we just kind of discuss them, then it's kind of like, well, do we really want to do the population? Okay, I'll leave that aside. The next one is de-energizing our economy, and I would say there's problems with that. And if we look at just reducing our overall average income, which I think this is the essence of the degrowth pitch, I think. Now, I would, if I leave it to just the last 2, which is decarbonizing, which is the final one, right? Decarbonizing, that means we're going to transform our energy systems, maybe without putting too much emphasis on the overall size of the economy, versus trying to, have an income reduction, which is sort of what we're calling for. Some of that, I believe, is valid and fair, because if we talk about global north and global south, certainly we don't need to have a per capita income of $40,000. You can have have a fulfilling life on something like $20,000, $18,000 a year. So certainly it's a good idea. And the thing is, can you imagine trying to convince an average Singaporean to live on $18,000 a year? Now, I personally can show you what that looks like. I feel like I live a fairly no frills kind of lifestyle. Mm-hmm. But am I going to advocate as my main political message to get political will? And that goes back to the constraints point and the realistic part, right? And it may be tying back to what you're saying about the paradigm shift, right? So it's kind of like, on the one hand, I feel like that's something that could work. I'm not saying no, but what I am saying is, talking about political capital and the amount of bandwidth you have to say your message, there's a lot that could be done on decarbonization, which without too much of those trade-offs to be made, I guess, in terms of, if we talk about trade-offs with having to get people to fit into a lower income lifestyle, I suppose.
I would agree that would be a better place to focus on, because there was a recent minimum income standard report that came out that said, for the average Singaporean individual person, minimum income for a dignified life would be $3,000 a month, plus or minus. So that works out to about $36,000 a year, right? So so clearly, even people who are advocating for a more equitable standard of living for everyone would set the bar higher. And I think that the main thing is, whatever income you have, what are you spending it on? Because that same $36,000 you could spend on flying in imported goods from all over the world, or you could be spending it on local services. And so what you spend that money on makes a huge difference. Focusing on low carbon ways of operating our economy, I think, is the way to go. And then I think, the other thing that you mentioned is, this whole idea of degrowth. And I think that's why I personally am drawn to the degrowth perspective. It's because it targets not just like global warming, but also, let's say, plastic pollution, biodiversity loss, because decarbonization might target the risk of global warming, but it may not necessarily do anything about biodiversity loss, right? And I think the risk to our societies is more than just from global warming. It's like from all these different things, which at the end of the day, I think depends on lower consumption. We have to somehow move towards a lower consumption lifestyle.
Yeah, just to say, we have a video on degrowth, so I'll provide a link for people to get a better sense of like what we were talking about in terms of the degrowth movement. Just one quick clarification. I do not think that the degrowth movement is interested in just simply reducing GDP income. I think the idea here is that it's the maldistribution of income within countries. So even though Singapore has a very high per capita GDP income, but the problem is the distribution, right? A lot of it goes to the top, and especially in America, that's where the problem is even much more salient, or in the UK. So it's really about that kind of distribution. So that's really one. Then two, when it comes to how we can achieve this through decarbonization. A very principal arm of the degrowth movement is to decommodify private goods. So and to decommodify universal basic services. So where is it healthcare, public transport, energy? The idea is that we want to decentralize or to make it much more of a public good, for people to access healthcare and transport. So in that sense, it's one of the ways that we can target social inequality without having to reduce people's income deliberately. And also, there's also the more abstract argument being made that 30,000 in Singapore is obviously very, very different from someone earning 30,000 in, say, Africa, also very different from someone earning 30,000 in the US. Each individual in each respective country has a different, different amount of access to goods, right, to purchasing power. So I think, the idea is that if society, that particular society is more equitable, then even if you live on only $30,000 a year, you could still be having, good healthcare, good, you still have your internet, you still have your computers, you can still engage in some form of luxury consumption, but it's not, environmentally or ecologically destructive. So yeah, so just a quick one. And that being said, let's move on because, one very important point we have to go through with you is your report on social movements.
All right.
So, and we definitely dabbled a little bit into that just now. So maybe I'll just give a quick summary first. So, I went through it a little bit. So in your report, right, like in your project, you looked at, quite frankly put, illiberal democracies or authoritarian regimes. That includes Thailand, Hong Kong, Philippines, Vietnam, and of course Singapore. So anyway, the idea here is that you wrote this report on social movements for a certain target audience in mind, right? What you call the impatient activists, people who are interested in, as we mentioned just now, more substantial social change. You're not satisfied with the current policy reforms, and you provide this report so that people can learn from it, right, to see what they can do to effect much more fundamental social change. So I guess the first thing we can ask you is, take us through your thought process, right? Like, you had different examples there. There was one in a European country of a certain protest that you used as a model, and then of course you had your experience in Hong Kong. So I mean, I just want you to take us through like what was going through your mind when you wrote this, and what are like some of the key takeaways that you want people to have from this, from studying your social movement report.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, so the motivation here was coming out of this whole policy focused kind of the conversation we were just having. But then sort of having this feeling like something's missing, like what do I go do next, right? I mean, so it's like, okay, well, social movements are how you raise political will. And similar to that was this idea that there was a group that felt like we could be going faster, So that was the motivation. And so I'm like, well, like, I like that idea because I could relate it to my personal experience as a chemical engineer. The idea that I thought is like, well, I design catalysts. Catalysts they're not consumed by the reaction, they just make it go faster. So I'm like, okay, like how can we speed this thing up? But from a social point of view. And some of the things that I learned, so I organized like what I learned from the report into an acronym, which is DIMRAN WONK. Okay, so DIMRAN was a thing that I came up with, and WONK actually I borrowed from another author who I cited from quite heavily, a US author. WONK is how you measure your success. So how do you measure, defining success is tricky, whereas the carbonation one is fairly straightforward. We have warming and temperature. Defining success as social limit is not so straightforward. It's, there's a saying that says, a well-defined problem is one that's half solved. That's a quote from this guy, is the CEO of Alcoa, I think, or something like that.
Let's actually break down your acronym first, so that people know what we're talking about. So WUNC, right? WUNC.
Yeah.
So if we break it down, it's worthiness, unity, numbers, and commitment. So these are like the different dimensions that you're analyzing.
Success.
Yeah, right, to measure success. Yep.
Yeah.
So go ahead. Talk a bit about like. Maybe let's speed up a little bit because you can't talk about all of it. So we don't have the time for that. So maybe which dimensions do you feel are very significant and that you would like to talk a bit more that it's relevant maybe for Singapore, or if you think it's relevant for the American context as well, you can juxtapose and contrast that.
Okay, so for social movements to really flourish, for them to work, then you need a couple of things. You need political entrepreneurs. I mean, you can call them leaders, right? You can call them activists. I don't really care what you call them, but you need those people that are the leaders, that that are crafting up these narratives and mobilizing and recruiting people, right? You need social capital, and that's really flourishing communities. That really is the ultimate sort of fuel that sort of moves people through this process. Then, of course, there's what's called political opportunities. And so a lot of people tend to focus a lot on the political opportunities. And that's things like, like the economy. There's this idea called depravity theory, which says that basically social movements are more likely to happen when there's an economic downturn or whatever. But that's not necessarily, it doesn't hold up very well to actual critical analysis. Is that actually it's really although political opportunities are relevant, they're not the only thing. Is that there's also the social capital, there's these flourishing communities, well organized, that have strong democratic underpinnings that really creates this transformational change. And then you have your actors, you have your leaders that are actually going in there. They're the ones that are sort of coming up with the vision, they come up with the message, they come up with the strategy, and of course they're taking high risks too, right? And they're doing this it's work, this entrepreneurial work of finding the opportunities, building bridges, and sort of deal making, and sort of putting everything together, and making it happen. Like demands, institutions, networks, all of them, right? So I feel that if we talk about what I've seen in Singapore, to some extent there's evidence that each of these is kind of being done at some level. Maybe the demands part, like in terms of researching policy, coming up, solutioning, we'll call it solutioning, right? Kind of like what I've done, kind of coming up with a policy research that's really watertight. There's a lot of resources invested in that. I think, for example, if I look at the climate rally, look at their solutioning, the policy research, amazing. I'm not even sure there's been that much, like if I look at other places, right? Very detailed, very well thorough, right? But a lot of the other aspects that I in DimRand, in some ways I can say like, it's hard to see evidence that there's a lot of that going. And one particular one, maybe I'll mention, is recruitment.
Okay.
So I think sometimes it's hard for, again, it doesn't mean that people aren't trying. I'm just saying it's hard for me to see it. To see a lot of methodical effort being invested in recruiting resources, whether it's financial resources, whether it's volunteers, but really actually trying to grow a movement in a sense, rather than what would be the opposite of that. Would essentially be like just keeping a very small scale sort of initiative that sort of like has never intended to grow. It never in their mandate ever intended to grow. It was just sort of a space, a safe space or something, right? So, but recruitment, you see, is not anywhere in the mandate there. So I think recruitment is not something that really is part of the mandate for a lot of the organizations that are actually trying to champion change. Or at least there's some barriers that I'm not aware of, let's put it that way, right? So I think maybe recruitment could be one area that maybe could work, but honestly, almost all of the other areas that are not demands could use some investment, I think. There could be some work. Any thoughts? Yeah.
You want to go first? I have one question, but you go ahead.
Yeah, I think the recruitment is an important aspect, and I definitely personally experienced some limitations around that. I mean, there's only so much, that I can do to reach out and get people on board, and I think it's just the reality of apathy in Singapore, right? So I would definitely agree that there's a limit there, and we it's a cultural shift that needs to happen. We have to be less apathetic. Singaporeans need to be better at joining, becoming joiners of things.
Yeah, I actually think maybe part of the problem we have right now is that we're living through the pandemic. The Singapore Climate Rally was in 2019, and then now ever since then we just haven't had that invigorated movement, like actual live movement. Right, everything's done virtually online. It's very hard to measure numbers and what's the level of recruitment out there. Hard to measure the level of concern. When everything's done virtually. So I think that's really one problem. We can't imagine what it would be like if we didn't have a pandemic. And if Singapore Climate Rally was able to go on, right, maybe it could have been a lot more, it could have done a much bigger movement than we would have had right now. The other thing I was just thinking of, which we should be mentioning, which is, as we speak, there's this university-driven initiative among some students about diversifying from fossil fuels.
Divesting.
Divesting, right, from fossil fuel. I mean, the universities to divest away from fossil fuels, right? So I think that's great to see as well. I think there are all these pockets of activism going on, and it's just a matter of like whether, as you mentioned, Taylor, can that be channeled and be intensified, right? And can they do a better job? Well, I mean, I'm not saying that's an easy job, obviously, but can we all do a better job of recruiting more stakeholders, whether it's political actors or even just membership? I think we all don't have to feel like we have to actively be part of an environmental group to contribute to this. We all can just be informed, kept aware, and try to sign a petition or provide political support when there is someone out there who is being that spearheader for change. So I think that's another way of looking at it.
I'm curious actually, because you mentioned being involved with climate conversations before.
Yeah.
And I would have thought, that's actually a good vehicle for recruitment because it's through your circle of friends, and when you try and recruit people to something, obviously they're asking, what are you recruiting me for? What do I have to do, right? And being part of conversation seems like a low threshold for entry. So yeah, I was wondering what your thoughts are on that as a vehicle for recruitment.
No, I haven't been able to stay in touch with climate conversations since I was initially a volunteer, and at the time I did feed back to them some of my critique. First of all, I think they are one of the most effective organizations when it comes to Singapore climate. I think they've done a lot, and in my report that I wrote, I kind of showed how I felt like they laid the foundation for what could make the climate rally even possible. So they really are kind of laying the foundation in a sense, right? Kind of behind the scenes. But at the time when I volunteered for them, I did feedback some of my criticism directly to them. I'm not that familiar with what they're doing right now. They may have pivoted and made some changes. In general, okay, so I don't know if they're doing exactly this, but one of the things that I kind of learned through my own study is, now there's a video I saw recently where a guy talks about 4 levels of action. So he talks about action, so just now we talked a lot about level 4, which is at national level and policy level, right? That's where you're passing legislation, right? And then level 1 is, like taking your tote bags and, these individual action, yeah, right. So what gets missed out in the conversation, which is something I'm trying to really it's something I want to explore a lot and talk a lot about in the upcoming podcast, Make an Impact podcast, is level 2 and level 3 actions. And that's honestly because the drawbacks of 1 and 4. So of course 4 is great if we can get it. It's high leverage. Why not? The problem is, well, how do I get involved? It's very not disillusioning, but disempowering. Is very not a lot of people.
Isolationist, right?
Yeah, I mean, okay, what do you want me to do, right? So, right, I wrote to my MP. Okay, he kind of blew me off. I mean, it's it leads you to a dead end. The problem with the other extreme is, I can do it, but did that move the needle? I mean, how many carbon emissions did I just save? So it's also kind of disillusioning in another way, right? So it's level 2 and level 3 that really are, I would call the low-hanging fruit, what I really would like to try to promote as really the ways to be acting, because level 2 is when you act with your friends and family. You really, me and you actually having conversation, and then, hey, why don't we go have a podcast? That's level 2 action, right? Yeah. And then level 3 is then if you're getting invited, or if you have your local volunteer group or even your workplace, where you have a couple team members where you have some autonomy, where you are known, and you can propose some policies like, hey guys, like why don't we like change a little bit how we make decisions on this regular, like, if are we going to take on this client or not? Why don't we change it so that we have a more democratic approach to that way that we make decisions? So now you're instituting policy changes in your local community. So it's getting plugged in and making institutional changes in your local community, in your local workplace, and your local, instituting like sociocracy and stuff, right? So that's level 3 actions. So level 2 is probably like where to start. And those are conversations that you're having with your family and friends. And I think a lot of people get stuck there because immediately they get gravitated to that uncle, but that's where I think climate conversations comes in, because what they helped me learn is to really get organized and have a strategy for your friends and family, and basically like make a spreadsheet almost, and bucket them and segment them into a spectrum of allies kind of framework, which is where essentially you put the ones who are your most active supporters on one side, the left, and you put the ones who maybe are opposing you or are not quite ready or resistant on the right, and then you have people that are neutral in the middle and some that are passive, et cetera. And that's something I learned from climate conversations, and I've talked with some friends who they found that step as their bottleneck step. They found that getting over that thought really opened up their mind and started suddenly seeing the possibilities, because they realized, because the whole strategy is don't try to move everybody on your side to the active. Just move them all one to the left. And that was just the light bulb. And kind of having that organized approach with my friend, that was really transformative for her, and that really got her over the hump. And then she started going on from there. And so that's where I think what I took away from climate conversations, to me, that's that message I'm really trying to promote, which is let's start really building those relationships and focusing on the people that are listening to you right now.
Yeah, because I remember, like Taylor, you mentioned how you think this could be leveraged also on like religious groups. You believe that the religious communities can take a more proactive role, in influencing and encouraging their community members to take more proactive steps in climate action. Well, on a personal note, I can think of like one instance where my mom, because she saw this documentary, she saw this newspaper article where there are this very sad pictures of whales who have been like they've been beached, that's right, and then there's a lot of plastic in their stomachs, and it scared her. Like she saw the pictures, she was like, oh gosh, I think I better stop using more plastic. So I mean, like there are little moments like that where I think just for viewers to reflect on, like where you can catch someone within your community, within your circle, that has that tint of environmental conscious, that awakening. I think it's very good to capitalize on that and to just like you say, involve them deeper into the conversation. So that's one way I can think of. I have something regarding a question on demands. Because I think it goes back to the Green New Deal conversation we just had. So basically you analyze the Singapore Climate Rally call to action platform, right? And you actually kind of like contrasted that with, say, the Hong Kong protests as well. And essentially you are analyzing the effectiveness of the messaging, because the call to action was, like, according to what they wanted was, number one was, the 3 demands were face the truth, combat the crisis, educate the people. Later on, they kind of evolved that messaging to be like power to the people, launch a green recovery plan, and redefine pragmatism and growth. And I guess what I'm reading from your report is that you feel like the more abstract the call to demand actions are, the harder it is to see successful likelihood of probability of success, right? And so I'm just basically asking you, like, what do you think is a much more effective, specific, and target-oriented kind of messaging? And do you think actually the problem is the messaging, or do you think it's more about, like, maybe there's just not enough public education and conscious raising campaigns, to educate people about how climate change actually will affect your livelihood?
If it's okay, I kind of split that into 2 parts. I guess one of them is let's say, campaign strategy, and then the other one is public messaging, if it's all right if I do that.
Yeah.
So on campaign strategy, I want to draw this, and this is something I tried to do in the report, is really draw a line in the sand between a campaign and a movement. And essentially, a movement kind of is a long-term thing that doesn't really have clear start and end dates or definition to it. And maybe it achieves very high, ambitious, transformational goals. Campaigns are very specific, limited. They have definitive start and end date to it, and they either win or they don't, kind of thing, right? You either succeeded or you didn't. In order to actually get a transformational change, you have to at some point go through this process of, it's like a bottleneck step. You have to ultimately get to a campaign. So social movements don't happen without ultimately being composed of campaigns. So when we talk about SG Climate Rally, now you can't, on the other hand, if you just have a bunch of campaigns that are just like unorganized, they have nothing to do with one another, then also you may not also see that transformational change, because you know it's like 2 steps forward, 1 step back, or something like that, right? So it does still help to have some kind of movement that ties it all together into a common, we're moving in one direction. That's what I think is successful about the demands of Climate Rally. I would say that that's more of an organizing framework for a movement. The thing is, you won't actually end up moving anywhere until you start actually carving out very specific and limited campaigns that have specific demands. So when I'm thinking about demands, I'm thinking about campaign demands, and that's why I want to kind of draw a distinction there. And so that's the difference, I think, between campaigns and movement frameworks. And I could talk about the public messaging part. So I had some thoughts on the public messaging, but I'll
go ahead. Yeah.
So when it comes to public messaging, there is this question that comes up, I would say there's this concern that comes up a lot. I hear it from a lot of people I talk to, which is, how do we get people to care about climate change? It comes up all the time, and I have a couple of responses to that. One is to just not bluff them, and just be real. Is that the reason why this is a hard problem is because it isn't really going to materially impact them right now in their lifetime. That's just being very real about the problem statement. I mean, if we look at Singapore, the direct impacts, maybe the seashore will move in a couple 100 meters over the next 50 years. Just be very real and upfront about the real situation. The reality is it's going to be very slow, gradual changes over a period of time, may not affect you during your lifetime, but you do still have to sort of change or experience some kind of change, now, which may be uncomfortable, maybe not, depending, for something that you may not ever see the results of. That is really the problem of climate change. So just being and not trying to paint it as something that's not, like try to spin it as though like, oh, actually this is going to affect you, when that's a hard sell. It may even be misleading. So, I was thinking there's like 4 ways of tackling this. One of them is, you say, well, then why do I care about it? Taylor, why does Taylor care about it? Well, I mentioned earlier about the disruption and the epiphany. So for some people that are like me, that can relate to me, maybe they have a moment of privilege, right? Where you kind of start thinking about things like your moral, your moral commitments. So I call this the moral imperative. And a lot of people, I feel, they think that's the only way you can reach people. And I feel that's a concern for me, because not everyone is going to be in these moments of privileges. The moral imperative is not going to work for everyone. So there's some other strategies, I think, that should also be considered in terms of public messaging, and also in terms of, let's say that you're talking with your 35-year-old brother who, he's not opposition, but you have his attention maybe for 5 minutes, right? I don't know if the moral imperative is going to work with him, but are there some other ideas? So that's when another strategy is incentives. And so you're familiar with the cost abatement curve, which basically means on the left is all the stuff that actually has a financial return to it, like energy efficiency, and on the right is the very expensive stuff like carbon capture, right? So start on the left, work with him where he's at, and work with those where you actually can, it's kind of like make them a deal he can't refuse. So that's kind of carrots and sticks, right? Use incentives. The next strategy is, it may very well be that you care about climate change and he cares about getting a pay raise. And it may very well be that that's okay, that you guys are motivated by different things, because the way that you would go about achieving each of these different goals is by a common goal, or a common enemy, some people call it, which is maybe a more robust democratic union structure, is the common goal that you guys will both go fight for together. It means you're not actually going to try to get him intrinsically motivated on climate change at all. You just let him be that he wants a pay raise. And it's the common enemy you guys have is that the concentration of power and decision making in that company is concentrated in the hands of few people. That's your common enemy, and you're gonna strategically align those goals on a common goal, right? So that's kind of strategy number 3, and then strategy number 4 is just show them the intrinsic benefit of being plugged into a really flourishing community, because no man is an island. And it could be that the hurt that they're feeling in their life on a daily basis, which may be trapping them in this short-term self-inward thought, is because they aren't feeling the real reward of being plugged into meaningful relationships that come with being in a community. And so you don't really have to talk about climate change. All you have to do is just show them by example the benefit of being in these flourishing democratic communities. And it may be that you never end up talking about climate change. And you say, well, okay, I feel like that's a woo-woo, some people may say, right? But these flourishing communities really are, when I look at all the examples of success stories, none of them had, all the successful ones that they all share in common is they did have these really strong grassroots, flourishing, democratic, at a local scale communities that had meaningful relationships and ties and bonds to their members, and they acted autonomously. So they had some independence, I guess, so they could actually go out and start doing stuff on their own without approval or something like that. So
yeah, I mean, I think of all your approaches, that this last one resonates with me the most. I think, and it brings me back to something I wanted to ask you way in the beginning, which is how you began as a oil and gas person and a Ayn Rand libertarian, and there's a part of me that feels that we want to give people like that the experience that we're really listening to them and listening to their concerns. And I believe you when you say that when you were within that, the oil and gas industry, that there were these values of safety first, and there were strong moral values, right? And that there was this moment of dissonance for you when you realized how the industry was viewed from the outside. And so I was, I would love for you to share some insights, if there are any, how we could make your former self feel like that their concerns are being listened to, and that are being held the same care that other concerns might be held in.
Okay, let me see if I got the question right. So if I'm talking to my former self, that's the question?
Yeah.
Okay, if I go back to Taylor in 2012.
How would you talk to him now?
How would I talk to Taylor in 2012? Well, first of all, he did vote for Obama, so
he wasn't all that bad.
It wasn't too bad. But it's true. Taylor in 2012. Well, he really wasn't too concerned about climate change, that's for sure. Take him out for a beer. Start with that. Relate to him on a personal level first, listen. Yeah, listen for a while, and I think that some people might get turned off by that approach. But the thing about these different strategies I've just outlined, because the first one, this moral imperative argument, right? It doesn't take that much listening for that moral imperative. You don't have to know anything about your audience for the more empowered. You just talk about you talk about the cause, and then you just send the message out. The reason why these other methods or strategies are harder, like the one where it's incentives, make them a deal, and coalition building, because you won't be able to do any of those strategies and implement them unless you listen and understand where that person is in their life right now today. So you have to actually get to know them. You have to listen. You have to open up. You have to go on the ground and talk to him and meet him where he's at. If people who knew me like as a student knew that I was a bit of a all over the place, like I was drinking drunken nights and stuff, right? So it's true. Taylor in 2007 was a different person today. But that's what I mean, like sort of showing up in their life. One of the things this episode is not for people in the U.S., but one of the things I wish I could see more of is people going into rural areas in the United States. I call it a chainsaw and a generator campaign, because when hurricanes hit, these are moments when people are open. Because most of the time people are closed off, right? But the moment when they're vulnerable and you actually have an opening is these windows of opportunity. And what do they need at that time? No, they don't need climate change. They don't want to hear anything about how the gas in their emission has caused the hurricane. What they need is a chainsaw and a generator. And that's actually how you build real political movements. That's from the ground up, is going in and you coming with chainsaws and generators. Now, what does chainsaws and generators mean? And to provide some context, when the hurricane, trees fall, right? And the electricity goes out. So you have these trees and you got to cut them, right? So just to explain what I'm referring to there, right? But a lot of times these hurricanes hit people in the Gulf, right? And these are the people where actually you can actually reach them. They're politically some of the most hardest, but in fact, me growing up kind of in that environment, I know that a lot of them are really lovable people, and they bleed too, and they're vulnerable. And so, like, what does that mean in a Singapore context? I don't know, but I'm trying to say that if you're trying to reach Taylor, if you're Taylor 2012, or you're trying to reach someone who's really just disconnected, you have to go in and you have to get to know Taylor 2012. You gotta have beers with him. You gotta listen, and that's when you're now empowered with curiosity to be able to solution what these generic strategies of incentives and common goals and stuff will actually mean in actual literal terms. I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, no. I mean, this is why, like right now, I'm deep into learning nonviolent communication, because I think that is a technique and a method of really listening to someone and being with them, right? And it's a skill. It's not something that comes naturally, because naturally what comes to us is to embody our own experience and to come from what we care about and not really try and put ourselves in the other person's shoes. So, yeah. Totally resonate with that.
All right, cool.
Yeah, so we got to come to a close. So I just maybe want to end up with just a few personal questions. So one is, viewers may not know, but you have made some personal lifestyle changes so they can live a lot more environmentally conscious. So I was just wondering if you can share some tips. I know you have a unique way of disposing waste at home, right?
Yeah,
so share a bit of that.
Okay.
So that's number one.
All right,
number two, is
my quirky lifestyle.
Yeah. Number two is this can get a bit controversial.
Yeah, sure. Okay, let's go for it.
You are a PR in Singapore.
Yeah.
Okay, so you quoted one of Singapore's most famous activists, Kokila Anamalai, right? And she said, okay, I'm just quoting her: "If I want to live in a society where people are able to speak freely, then I can't just keep asking, can you allow me to speak freely? I have to just start speaking freely, even when it's not allowed." So, Taylor, you're a Singapore PR, you're an ex-petroleum industry worker turned climate change activist, interested in social change. Do you feel you can speak freely?
Do I feel I can speak freely?
Yeah, with where you are right now, in Singapore, living in Singapore.
Yeah, I mean, because having lived with somebody who I could feel it was harder for them, I can tell that it doesn't bother me as much to speak freely. And it may very well be that in the end of the day, there may very well be some cost to that. My time in Singapore may very well come to an expiration because of that, right? So yeah, I mean, but it does, I don't know how to say, it was more like hardwired a bit. Very hard to rewire that freedom hardwiring. Very, very difficult, even if it may come at a personal cost. Sometimes the cost will come later and I just pay for it.
No, but I think that speaks to how we all are. While we're doing this channel, we all feel that, regardless of the cost, we want to speak, truths, right?
Yeah.
So that's one, very intrinsic aspect of what motivates us.
One thing my mom always used to say, pick and choose your battles. I chose not to go and take a lot of risks on every little thing. So I tried to limit, and keep a consistent message and be strategic, I guess, about when and when I do it. And if I can find there's another way, I'll do that. So I try to be more pragmatic. In terms of the lifestyle.
Yep.
So I recently got some new flatmates, and one of the things I asked was that they'd be up for these quirky lifestyle. So one thing is I'm not, as in when I do fly, I pay for emissions. But the last time I flew was December 2019 when I went to Hong Kong. So I really am not flying, right? Because I take public transport. I really don't take taxis, hardly ever. Public transport. I usually don't buy material things, so I don't do too much of that. Cook a lot at home, and I've got solar.
How do you measure?
I've got a solar panel. Sunseep, just
right.
Sunseep, okay?
Right.
Go do it. It's the easiest action. Sunseep, just do it. No questions asked. Just flip the switch. It's one of the best green decisions you'll ever make. I'm not a vegetarian. Low meat, okay? Low meat. I try to minimize meat. But when I'm cooking and it's tofu, it's whatever like that. So, and then the waste, the waste one is really quite. So at one point, I have a bin, and it has living organisms, little fly maggots and stuff like that, and it's really gross. Wow. It's really gross, right? But I mean, it's a source of entertainment, sort of. It's like a living thing in my home, right? And so I feed it my scraps, my kitchen scraps, right? And I mean, I hardly ever generate waste, right? So I don't buy that many things. So I don't have a lot of packaging. Right. I separate the waste. And when you do all these practices, what I found, I've been doing this for years, is that and everything all the wet gets composted. Like, there isn't much waste. I mean, there's three of us living, three guys, three bachelors, and I mean, I take out the trash once a week. And it's a little thing like this.
Wow.
Yeah,
wow.
No,
Impressive.
seriously, and it's really because we do waste separation. We're just doing the stuff that everyone keeps saying, right? And then, then I use the compost for feeding plants and growing plants and stuff. So, at one point, I was blessed with black soldier flies. Now I just have the fruit flies, and I'm disappointed, but I'll live with it because black soldier flies, they make these larvae that are really big, and they crawl out, and you can use the larvae and feed them to fish or whatever like that.
Oh,
I don't have it. I don't have the black soldier larva anymore, so shucks. So
wait, does this entail that you have to have flies in your house all the time?
Well, so it's in the corridor.
Okay.
It's in the corridor. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So you want to know more about my low carbon? I've got all kinds of low carbon. There are some areas where I'm like, hey guys, you caught me. So there are some areas where I say, okay, I'm not going to go that far. But for me, I mean, it's a low footprint lifestyle, and to me, that I'm a man of simple needs, right? Of simple wants. So.
Right. Okay. So why don't you just tell the viewers where they can find you, and and then we'll.
All right. So if you can follow me, so it's Green New Deal Making an Impact podcast, and follow me on social media. It's SG Green New Deal is the handle, check out the podcast. Send your feedback. Let me know what you think. I'm gonna add some comments I'm in the comments of this episode. I'm gonna put in links to where you can find me. Check out our first episode. Check out our other episodes, and we are looking for volunteers also. So there'll be 3 different roles. You can either be part of the podcast production process, writing, production itself. As well as the social movement side, campaign organizing. So we'll be looking for community facilitators, as well as people with digital marketing or like social media skills. So we have rules for these. So yeah, check us out.
All right. Thanks so much for being on our show, and viewers, I hope you had a good one listening to us.
All right.
Yeah.
Thanks
for
for
coming.
the invitation.
Thanks, Taylor.